So good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. It's our last class, I think, of the year. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started with some prayers. I think, Nancy, are you leading the prayers today then? Yeah, great. Thanks, Shayla and Nancy.
Taking refuge in generating bodhicitta, first in English, then twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge
until I am enlightened
to the
Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Sangye
Chodang
Chodang
Soki
Soki
Choknam
Choknam
La
La
Jangchu
Changchu
Bardu
Bardu
Dagni
Dagni
Kyapsu
Kyapsu
Chi
Chi
Dagi
Chunyan
Chunyan Gepe Sonam Gi
Drola
Drola
Penshir
Penshir
Sangye
Sangye
Drupar
Druparsho
Sangye
Sangye
Chodang
Chodang
Soki
Soki Choknam
Choknam
La
La
Jangchu
Jangchu
Bardu
Bardu
Dagni
Dagni
Kyapsu
Kyapsu
Chi
Chi
Dagi
Dagi
Chunyan
Chunyan
Gepe
Gepe
Sonam
Sonam
Gi
Gi
Drola
Drola
Penshir
Penshir Sangye
Sangye
Druparsho.
Druparsho. Great, good to see you all this morning. Let's go ahead and start with a little meditation. Give ourselves a chance to come into this space and focus our minds a bit. And then we'll do generating our motivation as we usually do. And today we'll do that by reviewing some of what we talked about a week ago in the third class in this series. So again, just begin by meditating on the breath. Choose whatever technique works well for you in working with the breath. Try to keep the awareness with the breath when you see that the mind wanders, and just let go of whatever distracted you and guide the mind back to the breath. So let's do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I'll come in and lead you in setting motivation. So now let's set our motivation for our time together today. And we can once more go back to that kind of basis upon which all of the Buddha's teachings are built. The fact that each and every being, just like ourselves, simply wants to attain happiness, to find a state of peace, well-being. And of course also wants to avoid suffering, problems, difficulties. But nonetheless, every one of us continues to be bereft of happiness, not finding what it is that we actually would like to attain. And of course, continuing to be plagued by problems, difficulties, suffering. So as you know, in this course, we've been working with transforming those difficulties, those problems, into our understanding of the Buddhist path. Let's do that in this meditation to set our motivation, particularly by looking at two of the topics we discussed last week that are so central in developing our motivation. The first was to see our problems, our difficulties, as simply evidence of the nature of samsara. In the very first teaching the Buddha gave, he said that life is dukkha, is unsatisfactory, is suffering. When we have problems and difficulties in our lives, it's simply pointing to that reality, that we are in samsara. This is the state of our minds under the control of our karma and delusions, having to experience the ripening of our karma into unfortunate experiences, into painful experiences, anguish, and so on. It's just the nature of the beast. Again, this is to help us to develop this mind of renunciation. It sees that we can't keep putting all of our money on samsara working out, trying to continue to influence things so that we only have what is pleasant and good in our lives and avoid what is painful. It doesn't work that way. That's not the nature of samsara. So the mind of renunciation turns away from the patterns we've been engaged in and turns towards liberation, freedom from all of our suffering and all the causes of our suffering, and really wants this for ourselves. And this is our beginning level of motivation. Want to be free once and for all from all suffering, all difficulty, all problems. Then the other topic that we looked at that is so central in enlarging our motivation is using our sufferings, our problems, our difficulties to open our hearts to the suffering of others, to develop the compassion that wishes others not to suffer, but moreover, the great compassion that wishes to help them to do that, to actually become the cause for freeing others from their suffering. This is the motivation that we want to bring to the teachings today, and especially to funnel that into the mind of bodhicitta. If we have that great compassion that wishes to free all beings from their suffering, then the best way to accomplish that is by becoming a Buddha. And the only way to do it perfectly is to become fully enlightened. In that state of Buddhahood, we then can help others exactly in accord with their karma, helping them on their path of finding freedom from suffering and attaining the ultimate bliss and happiness of Buddhahood themselves. So when thinking about whatever problems or difficulties that we might be experiencing now or that we've had recently, they can be an understanding of these two topics can be applied to them without a doubt. They are the evidence that we are in samsara, and therefore we need to develop renunciation of samsara. And moreover, they are the doorway to touching on the suffering of others, to opening our hearts to their welfare, to encompass their needs, and wishing to become a Buddha so we can accomplish that. This mind of bodhicitta. So bring that very firmly into your heart now. So everything we do today becomes a cause for that final result, our own enlightenment, and of course the enlightenment of all beings that will follow. When you're ready, you can open your eyes and we'll begin. Okay, again, welcome back everyone to this final class. It seems like the time went by quite quickly, and I hope I can do justice to the remaining topics that we have. Again, in the last class, we were dealing with the last bit of instruction. Remember, I divided the elements of kind of what our text was talking about in terms of these instructions, of taking whenever we're experiencing suffering and transforming it into an understanding of Buddhist teachings. And I took them into like 3 different categories based on the 3 levels of the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. So we were working with the 2nd level last time, and went on to the 3rd level, but we started with, again, looking at how everything is evidence of the nature of samsara, as I said in the motivation. When we have suffering, problems, difficulty in our lives, it's reminding us that we're not in the ideal state. We haven't attained nirvana. We are still under the control of our karma and delusions. So that's a very powerful way to utilize an understanding of our problems and transform them again into a deeper understanding of what the Buddha taught in terms of renunciation. But then we also went on to talk about the Mahayana, the great scope. And there we look at enlarging our motivation to include others. So as I was saying in the motivation, when we have problems or difficulties, it's not just a reminder of our own situation. It's a reminder of the situation of others. Every single being in samsara is still under the control of these factors, still experiencing all of the difficulties that we experience. Not identically, we don't have identical experiences, but they're all in the same nature. They're in the nature of dukkha, suffering, very first noble truth that the Buddha taught. So let's go back to the text. We talked about developing compassion, of course, which was one of the main teachings. I'm going to put on the slides here the passage that came after that, after working with developing compassion for other beings. We just began this in a sense. I talked a little bit about it. Using suffering to cherish others more than yourself. This was the instruction that was in our text. Again, the text is still available there on the drive that you have a link to at the website. Train yourself to think. The very reason why I am not free from suffering such as this is that from time immemorial, I have cared only about myself. Now, from this moment onwards, I will only cherish others, as this is the source of all happiness and good. So again, this is targeting quite specifically one of the main obstacles to our developing bodhicitta. We can generate lots of compassion, but we might still be very self-centered, might be tending to focus primarily on our own needs. So we talked last week, introduced these 2 demons, the twin demons. We're going to go into both of these in a little more detail to some degree today. Self-cherishing is the mind that's being spoken of here, the deeply ingrained thought that cherishes the welfare of your own self above all others and makes you oblivious to others' well-being. It's me, myself, and I every minute of the day. We have moments when we break out of that, perhaps, where we are a little bit more conscientious in terms of what others are going through and being aware of their experience. But most of our day is spent really focusing around this central axis of me and really trying to do everything we can to protect this I, help this I to get what it wants. And we don't necessarily tend to others in the process of that. Again, the antidote to this is the mind that cherishes others. I mentioned this last week. His Holiness says this is actually the way to be wisely selfish. If we really care about our own welfare, then we take care of others, because it is actually through taking care of others that we are taking care of ourselves. I mentioned last week, everything that we engage in terms of, positive karma, good behavior, is when we're driven by caring for others. We engage in the practice of protecting life, for example, not taking the lives of other beings. Then we are creating the cause for our own good health and long life. If we tend to their resources and don't steal from them and even become generous with our resources towards them, that's the karmic cause for having resources in your life. So everything you have that brings you any measure of happiness in samsara comes from you're being kind to others, you're attending to others and not doing things to harm them. So if you want to be wisely selfish, as His Holiness says, then you attend to others, because that's actually the means for accomplishing what brings you happiness. And of course, at the deepest level, through bodhicitta. When we are deeply dedicated to the welfare of all beings, then we will achieve the state of enlightenment, which is the perfection of our own being. It's the freedom of our own minds from everything that binds our minds, that kind of keeps our minds trapped in this very confined space. So again, when we move outside of that realm of self-cherishing and adopt the mindset that cherishes others, all happiness will ensue. I mentioned this last week, the Lama Zopa Rinpoche frequently saying that with the mind of bodhicitta and dedicating ourselves to the highest form of happiness for ourselves and others, not only is that going to be the result of that, but the happiness of this life. Because you'll live your life less concerned about all the trivial things that would normally bother you and be dedicated to keeping that good heart towards other beings. The happiness of future lives will be assured because you'll be creating good karma. You won't be creating the karma that will propel you into an unfortunate existence. The happiness of liberation will happen, right? Because that will be a natural outcome of your being dedicated to the welfare of other beings. And then, of course, the happiness of other beings will happen as well. So all happiness comes from cherishing others. We saw that in that verse from Master Shantideva. It'll come up on the screen again in a moment. This is the main target of a lot of our practice in terms of developing bodhicitta and the technique that we're going to touch on again briefly today, and especially the practice of Tonglen. That's the first of the twin demons. They're called twin demons because they have a similar flavor to them, but they are actually quite unique. Self-cherishing, once more, being this coarser thought that is really just all about me, myself, and I. The other one, self-grasping, we're going to get into a little bit later today when we talk about how we work with our suffering at an ultimate level, a deeper level. Self-grasping is this kind of very subtle mind that we've had since beginningless time. It's instinctively, innately believing in the intrinsic existence of your own self, really holding to this I as existing completely the way that we think it does, as well as the intrinsic existence of the external world. This is the root ignorance that is driving the whole show, that is keeping us unenlightened, keeping us in samsara. And the antidote, of course, is the wisdom of emptiness. We'll look at that again a little bit later. But the target for this developing of bodhicitta, in the terms of the second technique, there are the two techniques preceded by the preliminary step of equanimity. I went through these last week. The second technique is the main one we're focusing on here, because that's where we really target the mind that cherishes ourselves. In the first technique, we are primarily looking at seeing all sentient beings through the lens of being very, very close to us, as it says in these steps, trying to see them as having been your mother, which is not just as if they were your mother. Again, it's because they actually have all been your mother. You've had countless rebirths since beginningless time. Every being has been your kind mother, has taken care of you and with so much kindness, and we should feel a sense of responsibility to repay their kindness. We generate love and compassion at a very high degree, and then we develop the intention to do that for others, help them in the deepest way, of course, by becoming a Buddha for their sake, bodhicitta. So this is where, again, one of the techniques, it's a really profound technique to use, but nonetheless, what we're looking at is mainly the second technique, the instruction on equalizing and exchanging self with others, where we get rid of our pattern of seeing ourselves as most important and hold others as being most dear. So I won't read this again. I think I went through that with Rinpoche's quotes. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. It starts off with the technique of first equalizing oneself and others, seeing that we're all in the same boat. Right now, again, we tend to hold ourselves as being most important. We're the pillar of the universe. Everything revolves around us. I remember when I went to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1999, he did the Kala Chakra in Bloomington. I actually got a chance to take my mom to go hear His Holiness at the convention center in Indianapolis, where he was giving an introductory talk. And Robert Thurman came out first to introduce him. Professor Thurman was talking, and the very first thing that came out of his mouth was, right now, every one of you thinks that this is all about you. and that's really kind of what this mind of self-cherishing looks like. We think it's all about me, right? It's all about me. I mean, I'm not saying again that we don't have moments where we extend ourselves to attending to others, but that's our default mode. is we think it's all about me. We get up in the morning, it's what do I need? What am I going to have for breakfast? What am I going to do here? All the things that we need to fill out our life with attending to me. And it's a very subtle mind. And when we develop the mind that wishes to become liberated just for ourselves alone, it's there in an extremely subtle way. But it's in a much coarser way sometimes when we get involved in these patterns and we overtly neglect the welfare of others. Say, forget you, I have my own stuff to deal with. We turn people away or do things that harm them in the process of trying to get what we need. So again, this is a mind it's heinous. It's, as I mentioned last week, and when Harry and Mary were here, Harry said to my partner Patrick in the office up in when the FPMT was up in Taos, "What's worse than the worst cancer you could possibly imagine?" The mind of self-cherishing is the worst thing. It's the one that's behind all of our suffering. It keeps us in this pattern of tending to ourselves, and never breaking out to the mind that cherishes others. So again, what we're trying to do in this technique is first at least see ourselves as equal. It's not me up here and everyone else down here. We're actually all equal. As I said in the motivation today, because we all want happiness, none of us want to suffer. Moreover, we're all equally bereft of happiness. We might have a little more temporal happiness, but we don't have the bliss, the happiness that we can attain through developing our minds. And we all still suffer to some degree. Is there anyone free of suffering? It's part of the show. It's part of samsara. So if this is the case, we can't see ourselves as up here more important than everyone else down here, relegated to an inferior position. We're all on the same level, at least. The rest of the technique is about bringing others to this elevated level and lowering ourselves so that we're not constantly thinking about me, myself, and I. So again, I'm not going to spend more time than that, talking about this technique. We want to really get into the second part of it, which has to do with Tonglen. Here's that wonderful verse from Master Shantideva. Whatever joy there is in this world, all comes from desiring others to be happy. And whatever suffering there is in this world, all comes from desiring myself to be happy. Again, we look at it karmically. This is what happens. When I only think about me, myself, and I step on the toes of other beings, invariably. When I think about them, well, then I'm attending to them and making sure I don't step on their toes. And in the process, I create good karma. I often say, when we compare these two, with the mind of self-cherishing, we lose and others lose, right? Because we don't get the happiness we're seeking, really. We're just being, tight-fisted around our own stuff and not really thinking of others and not creating that good karma. And others don't benefit from our actions at all. In fact, they might be harmed by our actions. The mind of cherishing others, however, it's good for us and good for others, right? It's a win-win situation. If we tend to others, we create the causes for our own well-being, and we tend to them. They get what they seek in the moment, and they're not being harmed by what we do in the world. So this is the whole point behind this technique, is really to help us to get out of that habitual pattern. And as I mentioned last week, I put together a PDF document that comes from Rinpoche's teachings on the shortcomings of cherishing self and the advantages of cherishing others. That's out there on the drive as well, the materials for this course. I hope you had a chance to reflect on that and look at that. It's quite amazing what Rinpoche did in putting that all together. Having seen that this is what we want to do, we want to exchange self and others. We don't want to be thinking of ourselves every moment of the day. We want to engage in a very profound practice to exchange those ideas, to bring others to a higher sense of importance and relegate ourselves again to the inferior position. That's the practice of Tonglen, and that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. First, I'm going to share a few slides from Rinpoche on this, because Rinpoche was very much teaching on Tonglen a lot throughout his teaching career. So taking, again, involves taking the suffering of others. Giving means giving our happiness to others. So we get rid of that habitual pattern of taking what's good for ourselves and not giving away what is suffering or difficulty. So what Rinpoche says here, when you have a problem, another practice you can apply is the Mahayana thought transformation practice of taking and giving, Tonglen. Tonglen is the Tibetan words for it. Len actually means take, and Tong means give. I think my teacher was asked once, why did they put it together as Tonglen if it's actually taking and giving? Because that's usually the way you do it, taking first and then giving. He said it sounded better that way. I don't know. Len Tong, Tonglen. Anyway, Visualize taking all the suffering of other beings into your own heart. That's the taking part of it. That's the compassion. And then imagine giving everything, your own body, possessions, happiness, and merit to others. That's the essence of the practice, is being willing to take on the suffering of others, being willing to give away what we have so others can experience happiness. Many other beings have the same or similar problems as you do. Practice taking upon yourself their experience of those particular problems, as well as the suffering and causes of suffering of all other beings. Imagine that whatever problem you are experiencing is due to willingly taking upon yourself the problems of others, thereby relieving them of all suffering. In this way, you experience your problem for the benefit of others. When you are able to think that you are experiencing your problems for other living beings, you transform your experience of those problems into virtue. No longer becomes me, being resisting my problems and difficulties and fighting against them and why me and da 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 da, all that mentality. Because you are experiencing your problem on behalf of all those with similar problems, as well as all those with other problems, your experience becomes great purification and a very skillful means to accumulate extensive positive potential. I think that's the end of it. Then the last bit. The number of beings for whom you experience the suffering is infinite, and thus you can develop infinite virtue. So let me talk about this technique a little bit. Just most of you have had teachings on Tonglen, but I might mention that there's quite a different variety of ways that Tonglen is taught. And there's no real kind of right or wrong way to practice it. What I've already given you is the essence of the practice. Being willing at the moment when you're experiencing problems or difficulty to take on some level of suffering of others. And that can even be through some very simple thoughts that I'll introduce you to in a moment. The second part of it is also to be willing at that time, or even when you're experiencing something that brings happiness, to give that happiness to others. You still get to experience it. It's not like when you give it away, you don't have any experience of it. In fact, you might even have a deeper happiness because you've shared it with others. You've been kind and generous with what you have. But the idea is that this is the heart of the practice, and very different variety of ways that people talk about practicing it. One of the ways that we can practice it initially, just to get used to this idea, is when you are having a problem, is simply to hold that thought that through my having to bear this suffering, this difficulty, this hardship, may others be free of theirs. And you can think about, as Rinpoche says, those who are having a similar problem. You wake up in the morning with a migraine, or you have a car accident, or whatever the case might be, some level of suffering. You can think, through my having to go through this, because you'll still have to deal with it, right? You're going to have your own migraine, your own car accident, whatever is going on. You're going to have to go through that. Well, why not make it useful? Why not think about how, if you're going to go through it, may others not have to go through it? That's not even increasing your suffering. I mean, that's not taking on more suffering. It's just simply holding the thought of how wonderful if they could be released from their suffering through my having to endure it. Right? That's a pretty simple thought. That one doesn't require like a whole lot of courage or stamina to be able to think about bearing unbelievable suffering. It's just saying, okay, while I have this on my plate, let me put it to good use and think about it's helping others to not have it on their plate. But if you can have that mind that actually thinks about others at that time who might be going through a similar problem and think, may their migraines ripen upon me. May I be able to take what is going on for them right now into my own experience. That's more courageous attitude, right? To think I'm actually going to take not just what's on my plate, but put more on my plate. Take all of their suffering and put it on my plate. This is where we start working with flexing the muscles of our heart, trying to get things a little more expansive so that we can think about actually helping others to be free from their suffering at that time. Being able to take that away from them and experience it ourselves. Now, I know we've all had this type of mindset, whether you've been a parent and you had a sick child, or maybe you had a pet who was suffering, or anyone close to you, where perhaps you sat at their bedside or even just sitting there quietly thinking about them, you would say, I would rather that I be suffering with what they have right now than that they were suffering with that. I know my mother did that for me when I had a really bad fever when I was quite young. That kind of messed up my teeth, my dentist says anyway. I was sitting there with 104-degree fever. My mother's tending to me. And I'm sure she had the thought that she would rather have had that 104-degree fever than me. I have no doubt, because again, if you're in that close position with somebody, it's very easy for those sorts of thoughts to arise. To think, I would take that from you so you don't have to experience it, because you care that much about the other person. This is, again, an example that shows that we do have that muscle. We just don't use it with anyone outside of the circle of people who are close to us, perhaps. Do we use that with people that we see on the street, or with news reports from Gaza, or whatever the case might be? Do we really think, I would gladly exchange places and be there in Gaza dealing with the bombs and the, starving and whatever is going on there for people that's so horrible? I would rather that I be there and experience that than others continue to have that in their life. It's a pretty courageous mind, right? So we're talking about Tonglen as a practice to help us to get out of that me, myself, and I mentality and have the willingness to take on the suffering of others. Now, does it mean that you have to physically exchange yourself with others? No, because, I mean, again, we can't exchange ourselves with everyone in the world and experience all their suffering for them. It means we have to have the willingness to do that inside. So there should be some resistance to this. There should be a mind that's kind of going, this is a nice idea, but not for me. Because that's our habitual pattern, right? Is to really want to defend ourselves, protect ourselves from suffering. We don't run towards it. We don't some people do. Look at firefighters. I'm always amazed. It's like the courage that they have to go into a space where they're putting their own lives at risk for the welfare of the beings that they don't even know, right? Complete strangers. They're called to a fire and they go in there to rescue people, to put out the fire so they can save them. People have that, right? This is what we're trying to work on in this technique. And this is the first part of it, the taking away suffering. So the way that this is taught frequently is that, let's say that you wake up with your migraine and you think of others who have a migraine. You don't know them right now. Maybe you do know some other people who have migraines as well, but you can imagine people in front of you all dealing with the same problem that you have. And you can begin to generate some compassion looking at them in their suffering, because you know what it's like. You're having that same experience. So you go, how wonderful it would be if they were free from that migraine. In the same way that we talked about compassion last week, may they be free from that. I myself will cause them to be free from that by taking that away from them and upon myself. That's the level of, again, of courageous conviction we want to have in practicing this. Then they say what we want to do is visualize that at our heart center is something that represents this mind of self-cherishing that we're going to destroy, we're going to annihilate it. So I often encourage people to use something that's kind of like a thick, dark mass, like a huge rock or something along those lines. Something that will kind of feel a little uncomfortable in our chest, but it should, because this is the mind of self-cherishing that's, as we saw earlier, the source of all of our suffering, source of all of our problems. We want to annihilate it. We want to get rid of it. So some teachers say when you do this, you visualize bringing all that suffering in, and you can bring it in the form of like a thick, hot smoke that kind of comes down to your heart center, and it immediately kind of eviscerates the entire mind of self-cherishing. It's just totally gone, totally eviscerated, right? But I like to work it in a more gradual way because it feels a little too abrupt to do it in just that one fell swoop. But if that feels comfortable to you, to bring in all of their suffering, it comes away from all the beings that you are visualizing in front of you who all have a migraine. It all comes away in the form of this thick, hot smoke, and it immediately gets rid of your mind of self-cherishing. If you want to work more gradually, you can do that too, though. Bring in a little bit of it, and test waters a little bit, bring in a little bit more. With each time, think that it eats away a little bit more at the mind of self-cherishing. So it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And you can just keep, bringing that in. You can use the breath for this too. That's a very powerful way to work with it, to breathe in that suffering. To breathe in that thick, hot smoke, which should feel uncomfortable. We're doing something that is against the grain of what we habitually do. Breathe it in, take it in down to your heart center, and let it eat away at that mind of self-cherishing. Speaking of smoke, I think this was something, Judith, you told me, that you were with Geshe Cherub once. And Geshe Cherub, you were talking about somebody was smoking a cigarette near you or something, and you were saying, Geshe, I don't know what to do when I'm around cigarette smoke and what have you. I get kind of offended by it and everything. What do you do when you're dealing with being people around you who are smoking cigarettes? And Geshe Cherub said, I go closer. Remember you telling me that? I mean, again, this is the idea, is that we don't want to run away from what is uncomfortable. Yes, please. So let's get the microphone to you, Judith, if you don't mind. Yeah, there from Nancy, thanks.
Okay, is it?
Yes.
Oh, all right. I do have a thing I want to talk about. There's something happening in our place
Right.
where
Sarah
I
yeah.
live.
Mhm.
And I'd like to ask, why do the doctors
Mm.
don't talk to the babies or anybody about why, get them there. They don't go, they don't seem to see it. And then there's nothing there for me, because I'm the guy or woman who is doing all the things on the where I go every day.
All your tasks, yeah.
Yeah, I do the stuff, and then I have to do this other thing and say, oh, it's okay. And it's not. It's not okay for people who are not doing things from me, that they cannot get in there and do it. Or they hit somebody.
Yeah.
And that's what happened today.
Right. I remember you telling me when I picked you up, that someone hit you. I mean, this is where one of the things, again, when we're living in community, as you are at Sierra Vista, when you have other people around, be it the doctors or be it the residents there or the people who are attending to you, trying to do their best to care for others, we don't have a lot of control over things outside of ourselves. And people are going to be who they are and do things the way that they do them. And especially in the facility where you do have some people who may not have the ability to make different decisions in terms of how they go about their daily life and the things that they do. So you have to be and kind of develop that resilience and that ability to be with others and not necessarily feel like our job is to change them, but rather our job then is to change our own minds, to change how we are working with others. Sure. I mean, there's that wonderful phrase or verses from Master Shantideva in his 5th chapter where he's talking about patience and how the mind of patience is something we develop internally. He uses the example of the fact that we live in a world where there's a lot of rough surfaces. I mean, here in New Mexico, my gosh, there's rough surfaces everywhere. Start walking barefoot in the summer beyond like your sidewalk, and you're going to end up with lots of prickly things in your foot, right? We have this idea that wouldn't it be wonderful to make everything smooth, right? To find enough leather. He uses the idea of leather, but maybe in modern times it would be asphalt, cover the whole world in asphalt or something that is nice and smooth that we can walk anywhere then, right? He says it's a lot easier though just to put leather on the bottom of your feet and then you can go wherever you want, right? So if we cover our feet to go wherever we want, we also cover our minds and then we can be wherever we need to be. We protect our minds. Mind training is one of the most powerful ways to protect your mind. And we're going to see this coming up later in one of the quotes from our text, that if we engage in this practice, again, this is the most powerful way to deal with the reality of the world that we live in. That there are going to be people who are going to go against the grain and do things that we don't like and blah, blah, blah. And we have to be able to work with that, be resilient in that. Even when we're vulnerable in that, we can at least be with others from a different space rather than the same space that keeps creating the same problem again and again through criticizing them, yelling at them, whatever the case might be. Thank you for that. Yeah, I know you're welcome. Thank you for asking the question, Judith. Yeah. So again, this process of taking, you can work with whatever visualization works for you in terms of how you want to visualize the mind of self-cherishing, what you want to bring in. I mentioned this thick, hot smoke. I'll tell you one example that my the teaching assistant in the master's program, Jampa Gendon, he uses the example of in visualizing the mind of self-cherishing as being like a lump of meat at your heart and bringing in everyone else's suffering in the form of wild beasts, carnivorous beasts that kind of come to your heart center and rip it all apart. I don't know, that one didn't work for me. That's a little too much violence going on in my heart, but you know, feel free. You've got like poetic license to do whatever feels right in terms of this visualization. That's the whole taking part of it. And again, if it feels weird to do it with everyone with a migraine, well, then maybe do it with one person with a migraine. There must be somebody else in Santa Fe who's got a migraine right now, and I'm going to work with them, or wherever. If you can enlarge it to include, as Rinpoche says, all other beings, not just those experiencing a migraine and all of their suffering, well, then that's huge. I wouldn't start there, though. Rinpoche often even divides his Tonglen into working with the beings of the various realms. Now I'm going to work with all of the animals. Now I'm going to work with all of the hungry ghosts, with all of the hell beings, whatever. You don't have to do that right from the beginning. Once more, when you have a problem or a difficulty, think that there's someone else who's suffering in the same way and just start there. That first thought, as I mentioned, at least through what I'm having to bear, may others not have to bear it. But if I want to be a little courageous, a little adventurous, I'm going to think about others that have that same problem and bring their suffering into myself. Take it upon myself. Now, does it change anything? Does it actually cause someone to be free from their suffering? Probably not. It was interesting. Pema Chodron, in one of her books, I think it's the book that was originally published as "No Time to Lose." It's her commentary on Shantideva's text. But what she mentioned is that one of her teachers, when he was teaching on Tonglen, a student said, "Well, aren't you afraid that when you're working with like somebody with cancer or something, and you're visualizing taking away their cancer, that you won't? Aren't you afraid you won't actually end up with it? You won't actually get that cancer?" And this teacher said, "Nothing would make me happier." That's what we're aiming for, really. I mean, that's the sort of mindset that we would be delighted if we could take somebody's cancer away. Once more, go back to the example I was using, where you're sitting at the bedside of somebody that you know who's very ill, and you hold that thought, right? Which should make you happy to think about taking that suffering away so they don't have to experience it anymore. Again, this teacher showed that they've developed their mind to that degree that nothing would make them happier than if it were to actually work. Now, they say these really high-level practitioners can take away some measure of suffering from other beings. But for most of us, it's an exercise in, once more, developing the muscles of our heart, helping us to be more courageous in our compassion. So don't be really frightened and scared away by the idea of doing this. It's a wonderful practice to work on that resistance. But once more, again, don't, I would be very surprised if any of you were able to actually take away the suffering of another being. It just doesn't happen that way. And again, everyone's on their own sort of karmic trajectory. We can't do much to alleviate the suffering of others, but we can become more compassionate in response to that suffering. Okay, let's talk about the other side. The other side is the giving side. So after we've done this and we've taken away all the suffering of whoever we're working with, and you might even start with yourself. If you're having a really, really bad migraine, visualize yourself and think about yourself objectively as being just a being who is suffering and want yourself to be free of that. Nothing wrong with starting there, but do try to expand it to include others. Once we've done that and we've annihilated the self-cherishing at our heart, then we turn towards the giving side and we generate love towards beings. Whoever it was that we were working with, we now focus on them and say, okay, they're free of that. They're not experiencing that migraine or whatever suffering we were taking away from them. But they still haven't been brought to this level of happiness and well-being. That's ideal. They still are bereft of complete happiness and bliss. So we start focusing on them with the same three thoughts. How wonderful if they were happy and had the causes of happiness. May they have that. I myself will do that. Right? We generate this really courageous, great love that wishes to place all beings in happiness. Then you visualize giving that, all of your happiness, your merit, your resources, even your own body, everything that you have that brings you happiness, you think about giving it away to them. And you can visualize here, the way I do it is I visualize now that at my heart center, instead of the mind of self-cherishing that you've gotten rid of, you now have this beautiful, clear crystal jewel. They use this idea, this mythical wish-fulfilling jewel. They talk about it in Buddhism a lot. How like you become wish-fulfilling for others. This jewel is like everything is going to encompass everything that you have that brings you happiness. And you can even, what I do is I visualize infusing that jewel with all of my merit, all of what I possess in the form of brilliant light. That brilliant light becomes like this shining jewel at your heart, and you begin to send that light out to other beings. And you can do it with the exhalation. You breathe in the suffering and you breathe out happiness. And so then you begin sending that happiness out to others, and you can do this in one fell swoop, sending it all out, and it becomes immediate cause for all happiness. Or you can send it out gradually, sending a little bit each time, letting go of a little bit more of what we have so others can have happiness. And it depends on your own training and what you want to do. Once more, you can start with yourself, but it's good to expand out to other beings. We want to get this and flexing that muscle of loving kindness, wishing to help others to have happiness. Eventually, you want to get to a place where you give all of that light away. The jewel at the center of your heart has no more light left in it because you've given it to every other being or whoever it is, again, that you're working with. And then you can rest and be happy that you've done this. You've freed all beings from their suffering and gotten rid of your self-cherishing, and you've cherished others and brought them to the fulfillment of their happiness. And really rest in that place, thinking that all these beings you've been working with are now in this state of unparalleled bliss and happiness. Then, of course, you come out of that and you realize, oh, that was a nice visualization, and it helped me improve my loving kindness and compassion. I still have to do the work. So therefore, I'm going to dedicate myself to that superior altruistic intention, and I'm going to become a Buddha for the sake of others. That's the idea behind using it in the technique of developing bodhicitta through equalizing and exchanging self and others, the one that I was on the screen earlier. I want to check here. There was a comment in the chat box. Let me just see if there's something. Um, uh, okay. Yeah, there's a question about the verses. Let me pull them up so that I can show you where they are. Let me get on there on my. Oops. There was this passage. It weren't really verses. It was a passage from Rinpoche's Bodhisattva Attitude. Let me just show you where those are so you can find them pretty easily. Sorry, just take a minute to do that in that way. All right, so let me share that on the screen just to make sure everyone knows where these materials are. Yep, that's it. Okay, so you'll have a link to a drive that looks very similar to this. This is the Google Drive where I've been putting these. Again, the text is the text that's right here that I've been using. I'll keep pulling that up in another form later. Other materials is where you'll, whoops, maybe I didn't put it out there. Sorry. Mea culpa. Let me put it out there. I'll put it out there after class. The text, yeah, it's just a few pages of. So I'm sorry I didn't do that. For some reason, I put the presentation slides out from last week, I think, but I didn't put that. I will make sure that's out there later today. So again, those were just some passages from Rinpoche on seeing the disadvantages of mind of self-cherishing and adopting the mind of cherishing others because of its advantages. Sorry, apologize for that. My head's been a little cloudy with my post-COVID. So, all right. So any questions on Tonglen, on this technique? Yes, Mark, please. Wait, let's get the microphone to you if you don't mind, so folks at home know what you're asking and it gets on the recording. Right. Thank you, Nancy.
What about the idea that the intention to become a Buddha, the intention to help all sentient beings, is to some degree part of myself? And so it's like if I see myself as like say it's a machine or something, that does all that. I want to cherish that machine to keep it functioning.
Sure.
I don't want to, it's difficult to, you don't want to not put oil in your car if your job is to deliver food to people who are.
I understand. Yeah, no, I think what Mark's bringing up is a very important point, that when we say that we're exchanging self and others, so now others become most important and we relegate ourselves to that inferior position, it doesn't mean you don't take care of yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't tend to this machine of a body and machine of a mind and what have you. You do. That just doesn't become your primary focus. And you do that with the intention of being able to benefit others. So, for example, when you lay down to sleep at night, rather than, oh, I can't wait to nestle up in my flannel sheets in the winter and get all this rest that I'm just craving, and you do that so that you say, when I go to bed so that I can replenish my strength, give this body a rest so that when I wake up tomorrow, I can do more beneficial things for others. I can be dedicated to their welfare. When you sit down to eat a meal, you don't think it's all about shoving delicious food in your face so you can have all these wonderful experiences. You think, I'm feeding this body so I can continue to use it to benefit others. So you don't again fall into a selfish pattern of caring for yourself. You care for yourself because if you don't care for yourself, you can't care for others. And we hear this all the time in the care professions, right? Where people they used to call it compassion burnout. I don't know if they still use that term. It's kind of a weird term. You have to be careful that you don't overextend yourself, because if you do, you can't benefit others and you'll make mistakes, right? People who've been nurses, doctors, what have you, you know that if you're attending to others and you're on your 15th hour of being awake or something, you probably are not going to be as beneficial as when you've gotten your rest and what have you, right? So we know that this is the case. We do have to take care of ourselves. We just do it with that proper motivation. So it doesn't become an intention of, oh yeah, I'm just going to pamper myself and take care of myself just for the sake of those pleasurable experiences. No, I'm going to take care of myself because I know if I don't do that, I can't benefit others. Does that make sense? And yeah. Any other comments or questions on this whole bit? Yeah, Phyllis, please. And then we'll go back to Tony. Yeah.
When you were talking about doing Tonglen and you said, does it really help anybody? You said probably not.
Well, probably not in terms of taking away their suffering at the moment. Like if you're meditating on removing the suffering of somebody you see, you drive past an accident and you see that they're on the road injured, will that take away their bleeding leg onto your bleeding leg? Probably not.
So what about your teaching? You're teaching this process to
Mhm.
us. Do you think it's benefiting us?
I hope so. No, but I mean, I think we're talking about two different examples there.
Okay.
Though. I mean, when I'm teaching the Dharma, or when anybody's teaching the Dharma, they're doing it with the intention of you being able to hear the teachings, integrate them into your mind, and achieve some benefit from them. It's not like I'm taking away your suffering directly at that moment. And I'm investing in your future well-being, hopefully, through giving you teachings that you can use in your life.
So what's the point of doing a Tonglen on somebody who's just had an accident and you drove by?
It's primarily to open your heart.
But isn't that self-cherishing? We're doing it
No,
for
because you're
ourselves.
opening your heart so you can be a benefit to others.
Okay. But you see it.
So, this is all couched in bodhicitta, in that overarching motivation we want to have for everything we do. If we have bodhicitta, then nothing is ever divorced from that. Whenever we're tending to ourselves or whenever we're trying to develop our own wisdom or compassion, whatever, we're doing it with that motivation of benefiting others. I might mention that when Rinpoche teaches, or at least in some of the teachings he gave, I was quite, picked this up and really was quite moved by it. He says, in bodhicitta you have those two motivations, right? I'm going to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. And of course, I'm going to become a Buddha as part of that. For the sake of all beings is the other part of it. And sometimes the way we recite it, we think it's the first one is the primary one, right? I'm going to become a Buddha. I'm going to become a Buddha. I'm going to become a Buddha. And that can become very self-cherishing if all we think about is I'm tending to myself. Rinpoche says the second one is actually the main motivation, so I can benefit all beings. That's why we have to flex our muscle of compassion and loving kindness all the time to increase our concern about the welfare of others. because that's the main goal, is for me to be able to benefit others. Me becoming a Buddha is just merely the means to do that. Well, I sometimes use this example. Some of you have heard this before. Let's use a worldly example. Say you have a young girl who has had many people die of cancer in her life. Maybe she even lost a parent to cancer or some siblings to cancer. So, she's had this experience growing up to see how horrible cancer is in terms of the suffering it causes and the loss that can occur from it. So she becomes dedicated at a very young age to helping people with cancer. She's like 6, 7 years old, right? She can't help people with cancer at 6, 7 years old, right? She has to become qualified to help people with cancer. She has to become an oncologist or a cancer researcher or whatever the case might be. So she dedicates herself to going through improving her own abilities, improving her knowledge, increasing her skills and abilities so she can come out of all of that and help people with cancer. Right? So it's a similar example. We become primarily motivated by wanting to benefit other beings, but we recognize that in our current level of development, we're incapable of doing that. I mean, I can barely help myself, much less other beings, to find, real peace and happiness. I have to become more qualified. So just like that young girl dedicating herself to becoming educated and trained so she can be a benefit to others and who have cancer, I need to dedicate myself to becoming more qualified by developing my compassion, my love, my wisdom, my patience, my generosity, all these things, so I can then benefit others. So I think back to your original question, it's two very different things. When we are giving information to others and we are trying to help others and when we're working on developing our own understanding, it's always within the motivation of benefiting others. But we're not going to see that benefit in the moment. We're going to see it over time as we become more and more capable. And eventually, in the state of Buddhahood, we'll be able to help others perfectly. Yes, help them while you can, while you're getting there. Don't think, oh, I can't help you because I'm not a Buddha yet. Well, no, you can. You can do what you can do as a functioning human being in this world to tend to the sufferings of others. But recognize that's very limited. It's only going to be when you become a Buddha that you can then benefit others perfectly. So does that make sense then, Phyllis, and everything? Yeah. Tony, you have got a comment or question, please. And then if there's anyone online, if you do have anything, please put up your little raise hand sign and I'll make sure, because I would like to deal with some of the questions around this before I talk about emptiness, because that will be its own teaching anyway. Yeah, Tony, please.
So can everybody hear me? Am I
Yes.
doing this right? Okay, cool. So I'd like to suggest kind of a middle way of of helping others. And that would be, well, I guess I have to use myself as the example because I'm closest to it. I'm a healer. I was born that way. My grandma and great grandma were both curanderas. Those are the healers from the tradition of both the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Hispanics. I was simply born that way. That's my practice. I have two practices. One is the Dharma, the other is healing. I've been doing this all my life. And it's not that I heal others, but I help others to heal. Both working together.
Right.
And as kind of like step into full-blown Tonglen. Visualize yourself as helping others to heal and not necessarily taking on that blackness and these biting demons or whatever they but just something in the middle before you do Tonglen.
Okay.
Just a step.
Yeah.
A recommendation. It works for me. It works for my clients. Professionally since 1968. And when I was a kid, I was like the kissing kid. Yeah, it's totally true. Like like an uncle would come to the house. Oi, Anthony, I have such a headache. Kiss my head. I'd kiss their head. Yes, and it would go away. Little kids in the neighborhood, I kiss their boo-boos.
Yeah.
You know, they go, Mom, I have a go see Anthony. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
We can do that for one another.
Sure.
And I've taught people
Mhm.
to do that for others. So I
Mhm.
know from direct experience.
Good, good.
Thank you.
Right, right. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, again, I want people to be comfortable in what they choose to work with, because I think we're all at different levels. And, you know, so please, if anything I'm saying sounds like it's too extreme or moving too fast, go to this idea of just, you know, being in a symbiotic relationship with others, helping that healing to happen or whatever in the world. I think that's perfectly fine as a stepping stone. Let's go to Mary online before was there another question in the Gompa? Or Mary, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and asking your question or comment. Oh, we're not hearing you. You're not unmuted yet. There you go.
Hi, Gen Don. I dropped it into the chat, but
Oh, okay. I can go.
not to disagree, but I feel like when we do offer a practice, when we actually do Tonglen, we do offer energy, and that energy is positive. You know, when we send it out, and it changes, it does benefit others. No matter what, I think it does work. Sure, we might, we're not going to be able to, at this point, well, maybe some of you can take away someone's cancer, but I think just the energy that we're sending out, the benefit, the positive vibes, whatever you want to do, does create change.
Absolutely. No, I would agree with you, Marianne. When I was answering Phyllis's question, I forgot to add on. I said we do Tonglen for ourselves, but that doesn't mean that others aren't benefiting. And that was kind of what the follow-up when she asked, well, isn't that selfish? And I'm like, no, because we're doing it for others. So there is a positive energy, certainly, that's created. And the more people that are engaged in this practice, I mean, it would be wonderful to think about having a Tonglen day or something where you would have all around the planet people engage in that practice. You know, and you would probably see some noticeable effect from that. What I was trying to get at, though, was that don't think that if you're working, as was said in that question to that Lama, if you're working with a specific person with a problem, that by just the force of your doing that for them, that you're going to be able to remove that other person's suffering in the moment. Because I think that's a whole nother level of practice that most of us are simply not at. And again, I think it's extremely rare. Maka, did you want to make a comment or question? This might be the last one because I do have to get to some more material so I can get through what I need to, but please unmute. You're not unmuted yet. Yeah. There you go.
When you were talking, I thought of something, so I just want to throw it in and make a comment. It kind of goes along the same line of Tony's comment.
Mhm.
So when I was at a high-level bodywork school to learn different forms of massage, and one of the issues that the instructors talked about is that we would, because we're doing hands-on people's bodies, and some of them have, pretty intense, dis-eases, and there was an issue that we would take on the people's problems. And somebody asked about it, and the teacher said, what's your intention? What's your intention? Because we didn't want to walk away and be all messed up. And
Right.
so another thing that we learned was it was sort of a visualization that whatever that we were helping the person to release, it would like flow and kind of drip out some long roots that came out of our elbows.
Right.
So it's just like another kind of, we're all kind of like questioning how this Tonglen really is, whether it's a metaphor or that kind of thing. Anyway, I had to comment.
No, thank you for sharing that. Again, feel free to work with whatever visualization works for you. I mean, if bringing all that into your heart center and having it dissolve the self-cherishing feels weird, maybe at that point you can then breathe all that out, whatever waste is left or whatever something, and think it just disappears in the air. I don't know. I don't, pay attention to your own mind and your own heart as you're doing this, and what feels like something that maybe is where it's getting stuck or where you have some problems or some resistance. Pema Chodron is quite interesting. She says, if we do see we've got some resistance and we're doing this practice, well, then maybe we turn to ourselves dealing with that resistance and we breathe in our resistance and let it dissolve. And then we breathe out the looseness and the ability to work with that. I mean, everything is grist for the mill when it comes to working with Tonglen. But again, going back to the text and what we're working with in this section in particular is that we're talking about this way of trying to get rid of this tendency we have of being self-centered and focus on just our own well-being and having a mind that is more concerned about the welfare of others, but recognizing, as we've had with questions from Mark and Phyllis and whatever, that we still do have to take care of ourselves, and taking care of ourselves is done within the larger goal of tending to others. So we continue to do that work. Tonglen's a very powerful way to work with that. Let me just go to the text there. I've got some of the passages from the text in our slides here, and I'll try to go through these somewhat quickly. Oh, actually, this is still from Rinpoche. The practice of bodhicitta, then, he says, is your best protection. Practicing bodhicitta gives better protection than spending life after life for hundreds of eons learning to protect yourself with karate. The power of bodhicitta is incomparable. The power of atomic bombs is completely insignificant when compared to the power of one good heart. So again, this gets to what Mary was saying, too, that there is a power to what we are doing, and the power can be experienced in a wider range. But again, we just have to keep tending to it and growing that, developing that. Unless you change the way you use your mind, there will always be an enemy to harm you. There will always be unfortunate circumstances to befall you. But if all the people in the world truly possessed bodhicitta, again, that one day of Tonglen even, we would have no need for guns, bombs, armies, and police. Lama Yeshe, he says, his own precious teacher, the founder of our organization, used to say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. A good heart a day keeps the enemy away. Right? So back to our text. We're on this whole topic of cultivating the attitude of being joyful when suffering arises. This is the overarching one that is about how we utilize what is happening and we call suffering as an opportunity to practice the path. He says, it's extremely difficult to use suffering as the path when it has already struck and is staring us in the face. That is why it is crucial to become familiar in advance with the specific practices to be used when misfortune and difficulties befall us. It is also particularly helpful and will really count if we use the practice we know best and of which we have a clear personal experience. So this is something that was said way earlier too, that we need to practice these techniques. Don't think that you can just pull them out in a moment and they become useful for you in the face of whatever suffering you're encountering. With this, suffering and difficulties can become a help for our spiritual practice. But that alone is not enough. We need to gain a sense of real joy and enthusiasm, inspired by a thorough appreciation for our achievement, and then to reinforce this, make it stable and continuous. So with each of the practices outlined above, everything I've gone through so far, say to yourself, this suffering has been of tremendous assistance. It will help me to achieve the many wonderful kinds of happiness and bliss, which are experienced in the higher realms and in liberation from samsara, and which are extremely difficult to find. From now on, too, I know that whatever suffering lies in store for me will have the same effect. So, however tough, however difficult the suffering may be, it will always bring me the greatest joy and happiness, bitter and yet sweet, like those Indian cakes made of sugar mixed with cardamom and pepper. Follow this line of thought over and over and very thoroughly and get used to the happy state of mind that it brings. And this is kind of embracing that idea of seeing our problems actually as well springs of happiness and well-being. By reflecting like this, our minds will be so suffused with happiness that the suffering we feel through the senses will become almost imperceptible and incapable of disturbing our minds. This is the point at which sickness can be overcome through forbearance. It's worth noting that this is also an indication as to whether difficulties brought about by enemies, harmful spirits, and so on can be overcome. If we change the karma, we can perhaps change our own karma and experience. But again, that shouldn't be the main goal. The main goal is to help us to advance on the path. As we have already seen, reversing the attitude of not wanting to suffer is the whole basis for transforming suffering into our spiritual path. This is because we simply won't be able to turn suffering into the path as long as anxiety and irritation continue to eat away at our confidence and disturb our mind. If we're totally bent out of shape, anytime the smallest thing happens, get a hangnail and we can't leave the house or something, well, then we're going to have a problem, right? We have to be able to do the work. I'm just going to read a bit more from this section and a few of Rinpoche's comments, and then we'll move on. The more we arrive at actually transforming suffering into the path through what we've talked about so far, the more we will enhance and reinforce all our previous practice. This is because our courage and good humor will grow all the more once we can see from our own experience how suffering causes our spiritual practice and qualities to blossom. Once more, it becomes an adornment, an ornament, rather than something that is a curse. It is said that by training gradually with smaller suffering, step by step, in easy stages, then in the end, we'll be able to handle big suffering and difficulties too. We must go about it like this because it's extremely difficult to have an experience of something which is beyond our level of capacity, right? You can't, this is what I mentioned previously. I didn't look up who the quote was from. We don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. So train in working with these things. Then when you have the experience of a problem coming into your life, you are ready to apply them. And like that utility belt that I was mentioning that Batman has, we can say, oh, now I'm going to pull out renunciation and work with this. And now I'm going to pull out, annihilating my self-cherishing and all these things, you have all these tools to work with. But if you don't work with them, then how can you expect them to be there for you? All right. Rinpoche says something similar. I'm going to go past that. You can read these in the slides. I'll be posting them later. Okay. I'm skipping a good chunk of it to third paragraph on page 6 of your text. This is the summary of what we've talked about. To sum up, not only so that your mind will not be affected by misfortune and suffering, but also to be able to draw happiness and peace of mind out of these things themselves. What we need to do is this. Do not see inner problems like illness or outer troubles like rivals, spirits, presidents, scandalous gossip as something undesirable and unpleasant, but instead simply get used to seeing them as something pleasing and delightful. To accomplish this, we need to stop looking at harmful circumstances as problems and make every effort to view them as beneficial. After all, whether a thing is pleasant or unpleasant comes down to how it is perceived by the mind, right? It's up to our minds how we're looking at it. I'm going to share this bit of what Rinpoche says because I think this is just the most important in terms of the advice for practice. With this strong motivation as a foundation, proceed to train your mind until you become like an experienced horseman. Even though their mind may be distracted, they are able to manage the horse effortlessly, no matter what it does, without falling off or endangering their life. They're able to cope because their body responds naturally to the way the horse runs. Similarly, when meeting miserable conditions or obstacles, an experienced thought transformation practitioner immediately and effortlessly recognizes them as good. The thought of liking the problem arises naturally, like the thought of liking ice cream or the thought of liking music. When a person who enjoys music hears music, the thought of liking it arises naturally without any need to consider the reasons, right? You don't go, should I like this music or shouldn't I? You just like it. It's delightful. Just like when somebody puts ice cream or cake or whatever in front of you, you just naturally are drawn to it, right? That's the level of training we want to get to. Or when a problem comes in, we just go, oh, a problem. Oh, good. Like Venerable Robina said, congratulations, congratulations. You got a wonderful problem to work with. Let's go through this. I'm not going to do justice to the teachings on emptiness, but remember that we talked about two main ways of working with problems. So far, everything we've looked at is through what we call relative or conventional truth, meaning the whole corpus of the Buddha's teachings that are kind of the method side of the path, one wing of the bird. The other wing of the bird is wisdom, ultimate truth or absolute truth, as it's indicated in our text. So the advice for this is, it's not very long advice, but practicing it is obviously very challenging, but we have to engage in the wisdom teachings of the Buddha to ever affect a lasting change in our own minds or help others to do the same. So what it says here, by means of reasoning, such as he uses the example of the refutation of production from the four extremes, which is a fairly complicated analysis, that things are not produced from themselves, from something other than themselves, from both or without causes, and this is kind of in an inherent way. Anyway, don't worry about that so much. I'm going to give you an easier reasoning to work with. The mind is drawn towards emptiness, the natural condition of things, a supreme state of peace, and there it rests. In this state, let alone harmful circumstances or suffering, not even their names can be found. So the idea is that we have to find techniques to help us to see through the ignorance and the grasping at things in a fictitious way. Once more, what the Buddha says is all of our problems are generated on the basis of mistaken conceptions that we have in our own minds, that we've had since beginningless time. We think that we, others, and the entire phenomenal world, everything that exists on its own in an independent manner, established from its own side. Like if I hold up these flowers to you right now, right? You know, there's a flowerness that seems to appear from what I am holding up, right? That the flowerness is out here on the object, established from its own side, existing by way of its own characteristics. This is how everything appears to us, and this is how we grasp at everything on the basis of that false appearance. We are living in an illusory world, a world where things are like an illusion, like a dream, appearing to be real in a manner completely contrary to how they actually exist. And we are believing in that. We are assenting to that. And this is why we're in the state that we're in, because we think there's this real I that I have to defend and protect and take care of. That's the self-grasping demon that we talked about earlier, particularly in relation to this I. You know, and that's the basis for so much of what we engage in terms of our actions and thoughts, trying to protect that I, trying to get what that I desires and needs. And we do that with everything that exists, from flowers to whatever. All of these things, we believe that they exist on their own, and they don't exist that way at all. They say that the king of reasonings, the most profound reasoning to realize emptiness, that things lack that way of existing, is the reasoning of dependent arising. And I think it's a much easier one to get our heads around. The first one is that everything that is compounded, which simply means caused. You know, these flowers have a cause, right? They come from a seed or whatever that, you know, they branch up. They've got many other conditions that allow them to be there, the water, the sun, the nutrients, all of this, people tending to them, you know, who grew these flowers for sale. All of that, you know, the causes and conditions that give rise to various things. Everything that exists that is arising from causes depends upon those. Can you have, for example, these flowers, can they exist without their causes and conditions? Right? There's no independent flowers here apart from their causes and conditions. Those causes and conditions are a part of its existence. But we are, of course, thinking that things have this independent status independent of their causes and conditions. Yeah, we can get our heads behind it and understand how there's causes and conditions behind it. But nonetheless, we still grasp at it as if it has its own concrete existence, not seeing it as a product of all of that. That's the coarsest way that we talk about dependent arising, that things don't exist independent of those causes and conditions. Secondly, all phenomena appear or depend on their parts. They appear to be partless, but they depend upon their parts. And this too is something we can get our heads around pretty easily. I mean, I don't know if flowers working with it will really work, but if we look at any particular flower here, we see obviously it's got many different parts in terms of all the variety of petals and every one of those having different parts and all the little other things in there, stamen and whatever, I don't know, all the stuff. I'm not a botanist, but and then of course, you know, the stem and all these, you have all of these that give rise to the appearance of these flowers in front of you, right? Can you have the flowers there without all their parts? Maybe you could lose a few parts, maybe you could lose a few petals or something, but in essence, everything depends upon its parts. Look at the eye. What are the parts of the eye? Because this is again where we have most of our difficulty. We grasp at this eye as if it's got an independent status. Well, the two main parts of this eye are the body and the mind, right? I can talk about my body and my mind. You know, can you have the me existing without those two parts? Can Don exist without Don's body and Don's mind being there? No, because once Don's mind leaves, then Don doesn't exist anymore. And the body that is there is not Don anymore, right? So we have, again, this dependence upon parts, and then each of those things depends upon more parts, and so on. Everything in this process of never finding anything that's partless. Scientists are trying to get down to the most minuscule parts, the building blocks of everything. I think they use this term, the God particle or something, I don't know. They don't find anything that they can isolate and say, this is the final part that everything consists of. Because even those small parts would have other parts to them. They would have the left side, the right side, the top, the bottom, right? Second level of dependent arising gets a little more profound, but still something we can get our heads behind, right? We understand that flowers have parts, bodies have parts, people have parts. Third level is the most profound, and this is where we come to the conclusion that at the deepest level, things depend upon mere imputation, conceptuality, imputation. So when we go back to the sense of an I that is here, what this is telling us is that there is a body and a mind that is sitting on this chair or cushion, whatever you're sitting on, but there is no I that is there together with it. Its I is simply a concept, a label, a designation that is being given to this collection of parts. That speaks to its emptiness of having any real I there. I hate to tell you all, there's no real I that exists. There's an I that exists as a label, because I can give the label of I to this collection of stuff, just as you give the label of I to your collection of stuff. That's a perfectly valid way to talk about I, but that's the only way that I exists. Anything more than that cannot withstand reasoning, because the subtlest way that I exist is by us designating things. This collection of stuff as I, designating this as flowers, dedicating, this as water bottle. All the various things in our world, we organize our world through giving them names, which of course is involved in language, but also just the thoughts behind those names, right? Because we do have thoughts about things before we even know the name of them. Like if you had never had seen an iPad before somebody showed you an iPad after they were introduced, you would like see this thing, and they open it up and it's got an illumination to it and da 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 da. You don't have a name for it, right? But you're going, wow, and you're already holding a concept about what that phenomenon is. So we are doing this in regard to how we organize our world, but then we think the world is organized that way from its own side. That flowers exist over here and not as a thought, flower on this basis. And then, of course, petal on the basis of that. And, all the various little parts that are parts of parts are all merely designated, merely imputed. Nothing having a substantial nature. Nothing existing independent of our conceptualizing things. That's the final way that things exist. And it disproves them existing in an independent way, on their own, self-established, with their own identity, because their identity is given by conceptual minds. I'm opening up like a whole Pandora's box with throwing this in with like 5 minutes left to go. Emptiness is the most profound teaching the Buddha gave. It's an essential teaching in terms of this wisdom wing that is absolutely has to be there for us to attain our own liberation or certainly enlightenment. Because if we don't remove our own ignorance, we will never be able to benefit others to do the same thing. So again, very profound teaching. Mark, hold on to your question if you could for just a minute. Let's go back to this. I want to just point out real quickly that there are other reasonings besides even that one that was mentioned by our author, such as this one, the 4-point analysis. This is a really powerful technique. Again, there's other texts that will go into that for you. So our author says then, even when you come out of this state of like realizing emptiness, seeing some level of emptiness, it's not like before when suffering arose in your mind and you could react with dread and lack of confidence. Now you can overcome it by viewing it as unreal and nothing but a label. And then he stops. He says, I have not gone into detail here. That's all our author does essentially in talking about emptiness, is essentially say, if you are able to apply that understanding, that wisdom consciousness, when you're experiencing a problem, you realize that there's no real I that's experiencing a real problem. All of that is, again, merely labeled, merely designated. There's nothing more than that. And when we do develop that wisdom at a very deep level, then of course we become liberated from all that, because we are buying into the show so much in terms of putting all of this investment into this illusory appearance and how things are, when that doesn't exist at all. We've been going about creating our own suffering through the force of our own ignorance. So let's see what Mark's question or comment is. I probably won't have time to go back to our text and talk about some other things, but please. Yeah.
I've heard that description of a way of understanding emptiness many times. And every time it's preceded by a statement that that's the best way to understand emptiness. I don't like that. Because understanding that logical thing of parts and conditions and labels, it doesn't get me anywhere. It just okay, I understand it. Yeah. And then I stub my toe and then it doesn't help. I really prefer other methods of seeking emptiness, of which there are many.
Sure,
because
quite a few.
You pick anything and you can explore the emptiness of that thing. I just wanted to say that.
That's fine, Mark. That's fine, Mark. And I think
help me. It helped me get over the fence a little bit about is everything empty. But once I go, well, yeah, maybe it is. Then all of a sudden it's not useful to me.
Okay.
Anyway.
No, and that's fair. I'm again, the reason why Buddha taught many different forms of reasoning is because we are all of different predispositions. And so don't think that everything's going to necessarily hit the nail on the head for each one of us. We have to find what works for us. I might mention, though, that again, the most important thing, why this is called the King of Reasonings, is because it helps us to not veer into that nihilistic view. Because things still do exist. I exist, you exist, computers exist, flowers exist. They exist, but they exist in a really, really subtle way. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, it's almost as if they don't exist. So the dependent arising for me helps to get to that little sliver of existence. Things are merely labeled. And if I can apply that to my understanding of myself, I find it effective. But again, I think we all have to find what works for us. Please.
Yeah, you mentioned the God particle, right? And it got me thinking to the one question that I don't think Buddhism answers or nobody else can, and that is, you answer the why, but not the how. How did it all start? I think the Buddhists would say it always was, right?
Right.
Answering an unanswerable question. Scientists can't answer it.
Exactly.
You get to the God particle or God, but where did that come from, right?
Right. Exactly.
How did it all begin?
Yeah, I mean, that's what His Holiness says when he enters. What's your name, by the way?
Paul.
Paul, that's right. Yeah. What Paul's bringing up, I think, His Holiness, when he's with these scientists and they're talking about Big Bang or whatever theories they have now, I think the Big Bang theory is kind of a little bit outside of the realm of what they are holding to. But he always says, but there's something before that. Something before that. So if you say there's the God particle, well, where does the God particle come from? If they say, well, from God, well, but then where did God come from? It all becomes, and so I think that, maybe people who would adhere to a creator God actually believe in the same kind of concept of something that's eternal, that has no beginning. Maybe that's God for them. Well, for us, it's consciousness, and essentially the world that's created around consciousness, because the world is created out of minds, out of karma. So yeah, Paul.
It's the only answer to an unanswerable question.
Yeah. They say that the Buddha, when he was asked these sorts of questions, just stayed silent because he realized that, people are adhering to something that's a little too wanting to pin it down and what have you. And that's not the type of mind we need in confronting that reality. So thank you, Paul. Let me just see if I think there may be a question in the chat box. Let me look there. Why is it that the greater the Geshe's and Lama's understanding of selflessness, the more vivid and I'm not seeing what. Hope this makes sense. The greater their understanding of selflessness, the more vivid and is it individual? I can't read it's not coming up here. Amanda, can you clarify that for me?
Sure,
Sorry.
sure, yes. I've noticed that the more experienced the geshis are and the lamas who visit us, the more vivid they seem to be, the more experienced they are at understanding the selflessness of their very self, the more that individuality of them seems to be vivid and shine. I don't know if I'm putting it across properly. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I'm getting it now. For some reason, my screen was blocking a part of what you had, and I wasn't even picking up the word individual. So I think what you're, yeah, as I understand what you're saying, that maybe it almost enhances a sense of self that they are able to display to the world by understanding selflessness. It sounds kind of strange, but I think there is something to be said for that because, again, we're never completely negating the convention. The conventional, when it's enhanced by an understanding of the ultimate, actually becomes even more powerful, right? I mean, if we look at the goal in all of this is to become a Buddha that isn't just this fully developed wisdom mind that's abiding in complete understanding of emptiness all the time, hanging out where, I don't know, somewhere. It's to be involved in the intimate welfare of other beings, tending to them, caring for them. And we need then to make sure that we're manifesting and being in ways that are going to be complementary to those beings, having a richer personality, a greater sense of humor, whatever the case might be. Look at how His Holiness is. I mean, he's this amazing conventional creation, right? If this is a Buddha's mind manifesting in our world, it's not flat and dead and dull and whatever in this space of, complete wisdom consciousness on emptiness. It's vivid and individual, as you're saying. It's in the world being exactly what beings need to have in order to change their minds. Does that make sense? Thank you, Amanda, for bringing that up. I don't know if I got anything else in the chat box. Okay, I don't think so. Was that it? Oh,
Susan said, doesn't consciousness have a cause? Thanks for a great class.
oh, you're welcome. I mean, consciousness has a cause in terms of a prior moment of consciousness, but then every prior moment of consciousness has a cause that's the prior moment of consciousness before that. So you end up with this infinite regress in a sense. You never find the initial moment. Now, in Western science, those who believe in like a materialist view, they would say that the initial moment of consciousness happens in the womb when things start functioning enough with this massive molecules and cells and whatever that are going on in the womb to where consciousness arises. That would be a materialist view. And then you have consciousness until that stops, right? When all the electrochemical stuff stops at death and you stop breathing and the brain shuts down, then consciousness ceases. That's a materialist view. But that's not the Buddhist view. The Buddhist view is that consciousness is a phenomenon that is interdependent with that matter, but has also its own continuity of moments. And so every single moment of mind has a preceding moment of mind that it depends upon. In that way, it has causes, but you don't find an initial cause. In Buddhism would say this would decry the reality of causal conditioning in this world if you could find an original cause. Because where did that come from? We go to the same question Paul brought up, like where there has to be something that precedes that. Buddhism is more scientific in these approaches than most other spiritual traditions because it says, look at the world. You don't see anything arising from nothing. Things arise from their causes and conditions, and those causes and conditions have causes and conditions, and those causes and conditions have, you know what I'm saying, right? Okay. What I didn't get to cover in this text, we'll have to wait till another time, but essentially, I would encourage you to read the latter part of this on your own. He does talk about working with happiness and bringing that into the path. In brief, he says to remember two things conventionally: impermanence. Everything that you have that brings you happiness, it doesn't last. So when you're putting all your onus on it and getting all engrossed in that experience of happiness with delicious food over the holidays or whatever it is that you're doing, then remember that is just an impermanent experience. Secondly, it's also in the nature of suffering. Remember when we talked about this when we went through the last week? This is a form of suffering, the suffering of change, the dukkha of change. Those experiences of happiness are not lasting and they don't ultimately satisfy. And then you can work with the emptiness teachings in a similar way. There's no real I here, eating real food that's real pleasure and whatever. I mean, use that same, reasoning. But it's an amazing technique if we can use our teachings on lojong, transforming problems into happiness. I think it can be quite powerful. Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean, so we went through all the techniques working with suffering first, and then this little bit on happiness. Our text doesn't go into a lot on happiness, but this gives you an opportunity. I think it may be in our text, but somebody says, well, if we look at it and we go, part of our day we're suffering, part of our day we're happy, and if we're totally distracted by those things and caught up in them in the way that we habitually are, well, then we're not going to practice at all. But if we actually learn these tools, we can practice when we're suffering, we can practice when we're happy, we can practice anytime. So that's the idea behind it. Yeah. Let me see. There's something in the chat box that I need to attend to, and then we'll see. All right. Yes. Okay. You had already put that in. Okay. Good. Yeah, because we didn't have the microphone there. Sorry. Okay. Let's do our dedication prayers. Sorry, it feels like I'm coming to a bit of an abrupt end with this, but hopefully you've gotten the gist of what we want to work with, and ideally you'll have some tools now that you can do that. So let's just do the dedication prayers with the full thought of dedicating everything we've done to the benefit of all beings. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of our merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments, whatever diseases there are in the world. May they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Let's do the prayers for His Holiness first. As we recite this together, think that we're creating the causes for His good health, long life, for all of His wishes to be fulfilled, and the same for all of our precious gurus who are still with us in this world. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And let's have a strong thought for dedicating for Lama Zopa Rinpoche's swift return, so that he can be here with us again in a form to benefit us through giving us the teachings, guiding us on our path, benefiting ourselves as well as all sentient beings through his presence. We also dedicate for those beings that we're holding in our hearts. And in a form of Tonglen meditation, we can think about whoever it is that we know or who we're moved by, who's experiencing suffering at this moment. We can visualize taking that all away from them through the force of what we've done here, the merit we've created, it all just kind of dissolving, becoming non-existent, and then also sending out to them everything that we have so they can achieve their greatest welfare and happiness. And may all beings be free from all suffering and achieve the greatest possible happiness through what we have done here throughout this course, as well as especially today. Again, thank you for the invitation to share this text with you. I'm sorry it got a little shortchanged at the end, but I think the rest of it is fairly self-explanatory. If you can spend a little time after class just kind of going through the last few pages of the text, he gives some wonderful advice and even some measure of what this can do for you if you start practicing this way. But I hope you see the benefit. Again, if you can look at anything that appears in your horizon as something that's useful for you on your path. It's a total transformation of it and an amazing way to practice. I wish you all a very peaceful, healthy, safe holiday season. I'll be returning with the Wednesday class, of course, and Thursday night class that I've been doing in January. And then wonderful teacher, if you haven't ever experienced her, Elaine Jackson is coming to do the Sunday classes for January. So please come to her teachings, and I'll be back in February for another course through that month. So thank you all, everyone.